In this city, black skin color is still considered a crime. It was an early fall morning. The cold sun was barely breaking through the gray clouds, reflecting in the windows of the still-closed stores. The streets were almost empty, and only the sound of heels tapping on the sidewalk broke the silence. Camilla was walking home from school. Her hood was pulled up, music playing in her ears, her hands in her pockets. Not because she was cold, but because the habit of hiding had become her reflex. Being young, beautiful, and black in this neighborhood meant expecting trouble all the time. When a police patrol slowed down nearby, Camilla's heart clenched. The officer's gaze pierced her like a needle, long assessing with a kind of unpleasant glint in it. The car stopped abruptly at the curb. "Hey, you, come here," said a rough voice. She took off her headphones. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" "You look a little cocky," he grinned as he got out of the car. There was more than suspicion in his eyes. It was the look of a man who was used to feeling powerful, especially over those he didn't consider his equals. "Got an ID? What are you doing here?" He already had his hand on his holster. Camilla knew to speak calmly. No sudden movements, no arguments. But anger boiled up inside. For once again, for the umpteenth time, she was the wrong person in the wrong place. Her voice trembled, but she spoke nonetheless. "I am the daughter of a federal agent. I haven't violated anything. You have no right to—" A click of handcuffs interrupted her sentence. A glove fell to the pavement, then a bag. Camilla screamed as she was thrown to the ground. Passers-by started filming on their phones. Someone shouted at the policeman to stop. But he didn't stop. He even smiled. And it was at that moment that he didn't yet know that in a few hours his own life would turn into a nightmare. Sergeant Travis Bain was more than just a cop. He believed he was the law. And for people like him, the law was flexible, some for defense, others for sentence, especially if those others had the wrong shade of skin. He liked to feel fear. He loved it when passers-by averted their eyes, when conversations fell silent at his appearance. To him, it was an affirmation of power. He thought he was invincible because he'd been in the department for 10 years, because he'd been covered, because more than once he'd managed to cover up complaints, a false report, a lost camera video, a couple of calls from higher-ups. Everybody knew Bain was a problem, but they didn't touch him. He was his own man in a system where they covered for each other, so when he arrested Camilla, he didn't even bother to ask her name. He didn't know who she was, or who her father was. When he returned to the station, he felt the usual satisfaction. He filled out the report as usual. Suspicion of drug distribution, resisted arrest, threatened an officer. Classic, all lies, but already perfected to the point of automatism. The colleague nodded silently, signed without looking. The case was almost closed. Almost. Until a tall man in a dark overcoat appeared on the doorstep, slowly, quietly. He didn't slam the door, didn't raise his voice. But there was so much coldness in his gaze that even the captain cut the conversation short. "Agent Curtis Richards, FBI," he introduced himself. "Where's my daughter?" Bain felt something inside him stirring. He'd heard the agent's name. He'd heard enough to know he was in big trouble. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from. Have you had something similar in your life? Have you or a loved one faced injustice, bias, or discrimination? It's important for us to know what you think. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Each one is created with heart and total immersion. And now, we continue. The next morning for Officer Bradley didn't start out as usual. Instead of the usual coffee and shift change at the station, he was awakened by a persistent knock on his door. Standing outside the window were two men in sharp black suits, federal agents. He tried to pull himself together, but the trembling in his fingers betrayed his growing anxiety. His instincts told him something was wrong. "Officer Bradley, you need to come with us," one of them said briefly, showing his ID. "There must be some mistake," he began, but the words stuck in his throat. At the precinct, where he was used to feeling authority and confidence, he was greeted differently. Colleagues were looking away. Someone was sneakily filming what was happening on his cell phone. The rumors had already spread. The arrest of a federal agent's daughter had not gone unnoticed. But Bradley still didn't understand. He was doing his job. Wasn't he? At the interrogation, everything became clear. On the screen in front of him, one after another flashed surveillance footage. How he roughly pushed the girl into the car, how he prevented her from calling her father, how he shouted insults in her direction. But most importantly, how it was, all accompanied by a snide grin. He didn't even try to hide the contempt when he said, "You're all the same." "This doesn't look like a valid arrest, Officer Bradley." The agent in the dark suit looked him straight in the eye. "It looks like a personal vendetta, based on skin color." He felt sweat pour down his face. His story was cracking at the seams. The uniform he wore with pride now felt like it was burning his skin. And outside of this office, a chain of events was beginning that could no longer be stopped. When Bradley left the interrogation room, no one was waiting for him. Not his lawyer, not his colleagues, not even his superiors. It was as if they had all vanished. He tried to call his wife, but heard only short beeps. His name had become toxic. The news wires blazed with headlines like, "Police officer arrested black girl without probable cause." Racism in uniform is a matter of honor for the FBI, a system that no longer covers its own. Meanwhile, across town, a man not expected entered the police chief's office. It was the very agent who was the girl's father. He spoke quietly, reservedly, but his words were chilling. "You covered for him. Not the first time. I have records, complaints, ignored calls. It's all going in the federal report." The warden tried to object, but it was too late. The agent pulled out a folder and put it on the desk. There was evidence in there, dozens of incidents in which Bradley had overstepped his authority but gotten away with it. Because he was an insider, because he knew how to be useful, the system that had protected him was now cracking at the seams. The media continued to hype the scandal. Journalists guarded outside the house. Neighbors spat. Children on the street turned away. His past was now working against him. Every case where he had used force was now being reviewed. The public demanded blood, and while Bradley tried to hide in his own apartment, the television was playing a tape of his arrest, now his. At this time, the girl who had suffered at his hands was being interviewed. The quiet but restrained pain in her eyes spoke more than any accusations. She was not asking for revenge, but the country had already made up its mind. Someone like him must be punished. The trial was drawing near, and with each passing day, Bradley realized the justice he feared had already gone beyond the law. The courthouse was buzzing like a beehive. Crowds of reporters, cameras, activists with placards shouting slogans like, "No racism in the police! Justice for everyone! He must answer!" Inside the convention hall, it was no quieter. Every look, every breath was permeated with tension. Bradley sat in the dock, now in his gray prisoner's suit without the uniform that had once given him power. On the witness bench were his former colleagues. Many of them turned away, not meeting his gaze. Some testified in his favor, but most were silent. And worst of all, there were those who finally decided to tell the truth. They told of the years when Bradley had humiliated detainees, when he had allowed himself to educate black teenagers with his fists, when he had falsified reports to justify his violence. All of this was now coming out like stinking foam. Then came the moment when the girl's father stood up. His face was cold, his voice confident. He did not shout. He did not demand revenge. He simply read documents, cited official complaints, listed precedents. It sounded scarier than any emotion, like an indictment of the very system that had covered up men like Bradley for decades. "This man is not just a cop," he said. "He is a product of impunity, a product of fear and silence. And if we let him get away with this, someone else's daughter will be hurt tomorrow." The hall grew quiet. Even the judge looked shocked. But the hardest blow came from the last witness, the mother of a boy Bradley had beaten a year ago, accused without evidence of theft. The child ended up in rehab afterward, and his life went downhill. Her story took the audience's breath away. Bradley's hands trembled. He stared into the void, realizing everything was falling apart. No ties, no protection. Only the truth that now resounded in the voices of those he had once humiliated. The trial was still in progress, the verdict was not in, but it felt as if it had already been pronounced. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. After the shocking testimony, there was an unsettling silence in the courtroom. The trial was suspended for a few days to allow the parties to prepare for the final statements. But in the life of Brad Harper, a former police officer, time was no longer measured in hours. It flowed like a thick poison, slowly soaking his mind with fear, shame, and despair. He was in solitary confinement, no uniform, no badge, no illusions. He no longer dreamed of victorious arrests or admiring glances from his co-workers. Now his dreams were filled with the faces of those he had beaten, humiliated, and frightened. Especially the face of that girl, the daughter of an FBI agent, stood before his eyes. There was no fear in her gaze. There was power in it, contempt, and the realization that justice would come. Every morning began with taunts from the guards. He was no longer one of them. He was now a traitor. "Got lit up on the wrong side," he heard almost every day. Even prisoners who had once feared or respected him now saw him as a target. On his bunk, someone left a note. "You knew what you were doing. Now pay up." He tried to call his brother. He didn't answer. His ex-wife filed a cease and desist order. More and more articles appeared in the newspapers, digging into the past, pulling out cases that had long since been closed. His face became a symbol of police brutality. His lawyer talked about the possibility of a suspended sentence, but even he didn't believe it. On the fourth day after the pause in court, he woke up in a cold sweat. He dreamed he was standing in the very alley where he had arrested the girl. But now he's in handcuffs, and all around him were the people he had once humiliated. They looked at him in silence, but there was everything in their gaze: pain, hatred, anger. And he realized, this isn't just a trial. This is payback. In the evening, he was summoned to the investigator's office. He silently turned on the video. Surveillance camera from the precinct. That very night. The merciless scene, how he pushed the girl, how he laughed at her screams, spitting next to her, calling her a disgrace to America. Brad couldn't finish watching. He turned away, biting his lip. He was shaking. "Do you still think you did the right thing?" the investigator asked quietly. He didn't answer, because for the first time in his life he was beginning to doubt. It wasn't just people who were rushing into the courtroom that day. It was fear, hatred, and a thirst for justice. The atmosphere was so tense that even the reporters spoke in hushed tones, as if they were afraid to disturb something ancient and dangerous, sleeping under the skin of this trial. Brad Harper entered in handcuffs. He was thin, gaunt, with none of his former self-confidence in his eyes. He was accompanied by 2 guards, but it was clear to everyone he was already broken, not physically but mentally. This was not a former cop, but a man from whom the layers of lies, arrogance, and contempt had begun to peel away. The witnesses against him came forward one by one. The black woman from whom he had taken a child without explanation. A teenager he beat up for suspicious behavior. A former co-worker who quit after being unable to stand Brad's racist jokes and constant provocations. Each one was a nail in the lid of his sterling, as he believed, career. But the climax was when Erica Wilson, the same girl, took the podium. She stood calmly, reservedly, with a straight posture. There was absolute silence in the hall. Her voice sounded like a knife, clear, steady, but with each word it cut deeper into the skin. "I'm not a victim," she said. "I'm proof that the system can try to break you. But you have to stand. Even if you're being clubbed, even if you're being looked at with hatred, even if they think you're lesser because you're black. I'm standing here, and I'm telling you he knew what he was doing. And he was doing it with gusto." Brad couldn't look her in the eye. He lowered his head. In that moment, the trial was no longer a trial. It had become a symbol of all the pain that had been building up in the hearts of millions for decades. He became the face of that pain. And then came the climax. The prosecutor pulled out a document: new charges, unlawful tampering with evidence, destruction of videotapes, forgery. Brad tried to speak. The judge took the stand. His voice shook. "I was sure I was protecting order. I didn't realize I'd become chaos myself." Some in the audience whispered, some laughed, some cried. No one believed his remorse, because it came too late. The judge postponed sentencing until the next day. And in the courtroom hallway, the FBI agent, the girl's father, allowed himself to relax his shoulders a little for the first time in a long time. But there was no joy in his gaze, only weariness, because he knew one broken racist is not a victory. It's only the first step, and the war goes on. When the cameras go out and the journalists leave, the real reckoning begins, not in the spotlight, but in the silence, the very silence you can't hide from, even if you close your eyes. Brad Harper didn't come out the next day. He had been moved to solitary confinement after a guard found him sitting on the floor, unmoving, with a hazy look in his eyes and a note in his hand. He wasn't trying to kill himself. He was trying to figure out exactly when he stopped being human. No letters came to him. No one called. His wife filed for divorce. The son, who had once been proud that his father was a police officer, no longer answered the phone. Colleagues with whom he had laughed at the station and punished suspicious types no longer remembered his name. All those who used to play along with his cruelty had evaporated, as if they never existed. And now he was alone. There was an old metal mirror in his cell. He looked into it every day, first with rage, then with indifference, and now with disgust. There was no longer a hero in uniform there. In the reflection was a trembling man with eyes full of guilt. Not guilt before the law, guilt before himself, because he realized that everything his life had been built on was a lie. Scenes from the past came to mind. How he'd first let a white guy off with drugs but arrested a black guy for the same dope. How he beat up guys in the back alley knowing the cameras weren't working. How he laughed when someone cried. But now he was crying on his own. No witnesses, no publicity. Only on nights when the silence was louder than any sentence. He realized that fear is not about the cell or the sentence. Fear is realizing that you have become a monster, and there is no turning back. Meanwhile, behind the walls of the cell, Erica's father was looking at an old photograph of his daughter as a little girl, smiling ear to ear. He knew. Justice is not about revenge. It's about being able to look in the mirror again and not look away. And as long as he felt guilty, then there was still hope. But for Brad, hope was gone along with the man he once was. It's been months. The trial ended. The public forgot. The cameras turned to other scandals. Brad Harper was no longer in the news. His name, like a blur, was erased from police reports, and his story seemed finished. But it was just an appearance, because the real trial was just beginning. It wasn't a jury trial, it wasn't a courtroom, it wasn't a lawyer's speech. It was a trial where no lawyers were called. A trial that awaited him every night as soon as the lights went out and the cell door closed. He woke up in a cold sweat from the same dreams. The street, the night, the dark-skinned girl in handcuffs, the tears, the fear. And then a look, her gaze, not scared, not angry, disappointed. And that look was scarier than any sentence. Every morning Brad woke up with a pain in his chest. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a guilt that couldn't be cut out, drunk or forgotten. He no longer yelled, he no longer got angry, he no longer argued. He was listening and remembered. One day a priest came to see him. No ceremony, no prayers, just sat across from him. Brad was silent for a long time, but then he squeezed out, "What if I know I deserve all this, and more?" The priest didn't try to reassure him. He said, "Then you've already begun to answer to the real judgment, the judgment of your soul. And it is the most ruthless trial of all, because you can't get out of it early." He did get a letter from his son, lumpy handwriting, short lines. "I don't know who you are now, but if you really understood what you were doing, maybe someday we could talk." He reread that letter dozens of times. It was like a sentence with the possibility of appeal. And at that very minute, sitting on the cold bench, Brad finally realized, a real trial isn't about how many years you spend behind bars, but how many lives you've ruined outside of them. And more importantly, whether you're willing to admit that you've ruined yours too. It's been a year and a half. Brad Harper's out on parole. He came out unrecognizable, thin, graying with a downcast look. No one was waiting for him on the street. No posters, no friends, no family. Just the deafening silence and the inner cold with which he woke and fell asleep every day. Brad rented a tiny room on the outskirts of town. There was nowhere to work. His name was known in any precinct. No service wanted to deal with him. He scrubbed floors in a convenience store, hiding from people, avoiding conversation. And every night when he got home, he sat in front of the mirror and stared into it. For a long time, no words. Trying to find in the reflection the person he once was, but all he saw was rubble. One day he noticed a letter by the door. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. You can't bring back what you've destroyed. But you can choose to live in these ashes, or you can start building something new. If you decide to try, know that I haven't forgotten. But maybe I can forgive. Someday. S. It was his son. Brad clutched the letter in his hands as if it held the last drop of warmth in this icy life. Justice had taken place after all. Not the way he'd envisioned. Not through courts and cells and sentences, but through loneliness, remorse, and loss of self. He had paid, and he would pay for the rest of his life, because real justice isn't about revenge, it's awareness, and realization tastes like pain.